Good morning. I'll call the February 26th meeting of the State Pension Review Board to order, and I'd ask Ann to call roll.
Chair Paul Braden.
Here.
Keith Brainer.
Here.
Andrew Cable.
Here.
Leslie Cole. Robert Messenger.
Here.
Robert May.
Here.
William Roberts.
Here. Thank you. We've established a quorum. The first item of business is approval of the November 13th board minutes. I would entertain a motion to suspend the reading of the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion or any corrections from the board on the minutes as circulated? Entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm abstaining, sir.
Please note that Mr. Brainerd abstained, but everybody else voted in favor. The second item of business is excusing absent board members from the November 13th board meeting. I would entertain a motion to excuse Ms. Leslie Greco-Poole from the November 13th board meeting.
So moved.
Second.
A motion made by Mr. Roberts, second by Mr. Cable. Any board discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. At this time, I'd like to take an opportunity to introduce Keith Brainerd, who's our newest board member. This is our first meeting. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
And Keith, you're taking the securities position, is that correct? Statutorily?
I think the plan administrator, pension administrator role,
Okay.
given his background with NASRA.
Great. If you want to say anything?
Only that it's an honor to be here, and look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Don't we make him sing his alma mater?
Only if it's UT. Thank you. The next item of business is discuss and consider educational training program for the trustees and administrators, including various items, and we're going to call on Michelle Cranes to go over this. And the first item under agenda item 4 would be A, and receive reports from the January 29th working group meeting.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and board members. I'm Michelle Cranes with PRB staff. And as you know, we've now had our second meeting of the Educational Training Program Working Group. That was on January 29th. And again, we had a lot of good participation and discussion. It was also a very productive meeting, as you see that it led to adopting a proposal for minimum training requirements. And unless there's any questions on the meeting summary report behind tab 2, my thought would be to walk you through each of the items that the working group discussed, starting with the proposal for minimum standards, which is behind tab 3. Okay. So the working group adopted a proposal that you'll see in the chart there. The basic pieces of it are for new trustees and system administrators. There would be a requirement of 7 hours minimum of training within the first year of service, and that training must be in the core content area, and you'll see in the boxes below what would make up the core. Then there'd be a continuing education requirement for trustees and administrators in their subsequent years of service after the first year, with a requirement of 4 hours of training every 2 years after their first year. And those hours could be in core or non-core topics. You'll see the required content areas listed there. I'll just briefly cover the core, which would include fiduciary, governance, ethics, investments, actuarial matters, and benefits. And then you'll see under non-core a variety of other topic areas. So the next step for you all would be for the board to approve or modify this proposal, and then direct staff at your pleasure to come back to the May board meeting with draft proposed rules to put out for public comment. There are a few items for further consideration, but I'll stop if there's any questions.
Could you give a little more background as to how these were developed, or what was the process in terms of both the identified and required content areas and the minimum hours for each category?
Sure, and we've included behind tab 3 as well the report that staff brought to the working group, and there we had come up with a variety, I think 4 scenarios, and essentially 2 different ways that the board could, and working group could approach the reporting period, meaning it could be on an annual basis or an every 2-year basis, and you'll see that the working group did a combination of both, first-year requirement and then an every 2-year after that. And also, I think there was an attempt at the working group, and please correct me or add to my thoughts, to look at a variety of proposals from, a very minimum, looking at the minimum as setting a standard that we would hope and, of course, encourage plans to do more training, but to set a standard that's not burdensome, of course, keeping in mind that trustees are usually volunteers donating their time and service.
And it appears from our review of the background is you did look at other plans and other programs, sort of did a brief survey and presented these at the committee, and I don't know, Andrew or other members of the committee, if anybody wants to chime in.
We're very fortunate. We had planned participation and a lot of input, and that was very helpful and resourceful for us to come up with this as a working group.
And this was the consensus agreed to?
It was.
And what about the content? Was this developed by the same reviewing other plans and programs?
It was. And I believe we do have all those other scenarios here to look through, but it was a accumulation of all.
That's right, and staff received a proposal or a model from TechSpurs, which staff then added to, and the working group also made some modifications to.
Okay. Anybody have other questions at this time?
I have a question, please. Where does the subject of risk management come in, particularly in the core topics? Did the committee address risk management?
Not specifically, although I would mention that it is in the non-core content, the idea of risk control, but there wasn't a specific discussion on that topic.
Okay, thank you.
And members, just to clarify, and one of the items that the staff is looking for feedback from the board on is within these topic areas, how specific the board would like rules to be drafted under the core content area of investments. One of the questions that staff are going to pose for direction from the board is, does the board want specific areas such as risk management, development of investment policies spelled out in the rulemaking, or is the board amenable to content topic areas and allowing for more of a general guidance either through policy or accreditation to indicate that for a core content under investments it should include items such as development of an investment policy, asset allocation, possibly risk management, or that may fall under fiduciary duty as well. Additionally, there is some overlap between some of these core topics. I think the working group discussed that briefly as well. But certainly something that staff would like some feedback from the board as we move forward with the drafting of rules to bring to the board at the May meeting.
I guess my thought is that risks run through the pension plan and its administration. Of course, the investments, but other aspects of it as well. And I think that any trustee ought to have a keen awareness of the range of risks, beginning with investments, but the other risks as well. Starting point for the whole pension plan is the payment of the benefits. And there's a big risk if a pension plan doesn't or can't pay its benefits. And I think trustees need to understand that kind of risk as well as the other range of risks.
I agree. And I'm sitting here trying to recollect the discussion because we did have a lengthy discussion concerning what would be core and non-core, and I agree that the risk control under non-core would include it, but I'm just not sure of why we made that determination, but I agree that where we've got the minimum of 7 hours of training, we ought to be able to at least get in the basics of what is meant by risk management. And
was risk control intended to cover risk management? I mean, is there a distinction being made here?
think so. I don't think so.
Okay, so risk control should include that. So the really issue is whether we want to move that from a non-core to a core content.
That's right. I think you could go one of two directions. One would be to move it to core, and the other would be to leave it in non-core, but direct staff to make sure that it's included in actuarial matters and benefits, for example, or fiduciary or somewhere
Yeah, I
else.
was thinking changing this language to be fiduciary, including risk management.
Anybody have any other thoughts? Go ahead, Chris, do you have anything?
And members, again, to the point of how specific do we get within the kind of content description in rulemaking, the options, there's two general options. One is to spell out, and you'll see at the bottom of page 1 under this tab and moving through the second page how we've identified and working with other members of the working group, including taxpayers, some general areas that you would cover, again, under the different topics. It wasn't meant to necessarily be comprehensive or exhaustive, but to provide guidance for the PRB as we develop our own training to match these requirements, as well as for accreditation of other sponsors, other groups doing training, as well as pension funds that do their in-house training. So the board could consider the option of specifying fiduciary, including risk management, so to speak, or keeping as fiduciary, but providing more guidance that we would expect risk management would be covered somewhere in core. We can be as specific or non-specific in the rulemaking, yet still providing guidance through other means. Obviously, because the PRB will be accrediting training programs, we can develop a guidance through policy documents in the accreditation process to make sure that that topic's covered. But really, it's up to the board to tell us what they would prefer.
Well, speaking just for myself, I don't want to tell you how to do anything, but my only concern was the non-core content is not required at any point, only the core content, and I think that any trustee and administrator ought to be exposed to the concept of risk.
Yeah, and the question then becomes, is if it's such an important topic, does it need to be specifically listed as opposed to just part of the word fiduciary? And my thoughts would be, well, why not, right? I mean, just stick in the phrase risk control or risk management as part of the core content, if we feel it's that important as part of it.
We're still in really good shape on time in taking these recommendations, is that right, on our deadlines?
Yeah, the expectation and timeline would be to have a draft of the rules for the May meeting.
Okay.
So there is time to flesh that out. Certainly, and if the board's preference is to include it as a core content topic area, it can easily be added as that. It could be included under one of the topic areas as well. So whichever direction the board would prefer to go, we can certainly do that. We've identified, part of these topic areas came from the plans. When we surveyed the plans in the fall, we asked, what are areas you're being trained in, so we could kind of get a comprehensive list of what was out there. Compliance and risk control was one of the areas indicated. So it is a area of training, and as mentioned, it is something that trustees need to be briefed on, and certainly can be added as an actual core content training area.
I suggest we add it to core content, risk management.
Well, and it's actually, in my mind, more than risk management. As there's also an element under investment of understanding the relative risks of different kinds of investments, low, medium, and high risk. I mean, and I view that as different than risk management.
And I think in the development center of an investment policy, in most of my experience, that would be an area that you would want to address if you're developing an investment policy as a pension fund. Your investment risk would certainly be part of that process. You'd want to consider the appetite of risk in the different asset classes as well. So the expectation would be that investment risk would probably be something under the investment content, but risk management, as far as kind of a broader topic for core content, can certainly, if the members are amenable to that and as suggested, be added as a core content area.
But do we just move compliance and risk control up to core? I mean, I assume that these phrases are certain terms of art that you've developed as reviewing various content.
And we could just move the risk control. In a prior presentation to the working group, we had benefits and administration as a non-core. At the suggestion of the working group, we moved benefits to core, so that the board has the flexibility to break off a piece and say risk management as core and keep compliance as non-core. That was really taken from our survey. Those topic areas were what we received when we surveyed folks who are getting training now.
Okay, so I would suggest that we move risk management to core, and so now, and assuming we prove that, the question becomes wording. I mean, Wayne, if you had concerns that you said risk management doesn't cover enough, do we want to say, does risk control address your concerns?
I'm okay with just saying risk management. I think that any topic of it, I mean, we're not getting to that extreme level of specificity here. I think it's, Chris is right. Any survey of investments is going to cover, the risk of the different kinds of investments. So I just leave it with the risk management.
And we have the opportunity to define what that is as we want it to be defined.
Absolutely, and walking through, and we'll have obviously future meetings of the working group between this meeting and the May PRB meeting, an opportunity to flesh some of this discussion out a little bit more, as well as to continue to get feedback from the members. Again, the idea would be to have a draft rules for consideration at the May meeting, and that gives us time to flesh that out.
I'm just surprised this didn't come up at our meeting, because we spent quite a bit of time on this.
So when we make a motion on this, we can make that change. Is there any other discussion that people want on this? Any other questions?
While we're talking, can I share some other thoughts, please, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
This training is for trustees and administrators who presumably are going to be on the job at least for a few years, if not longer. I would think that eventually we would want to have administrators, if not also trustees, get training in plan administration and also pension accounting. Not necessarily the first year, but I would think that after 2 or 3 years they ought to have had that training. You take an administrator who works perhaps part-time on the pension plan and a small pension plan, and pension plan administration may not be his area of expertise. I think that we'd have an interest in making sure that person gets that kind of training. The same with pension accounting. It just seems central to the idea of administering a pension plan. Less so for the trustees, but still true. Doesn't necessarily have to be part of the core content, but considering that the non-core content is optional, in theory somebody could just keep going back to the investments training if they wanted, or the combination of the core content. I think that we have an interest eventually in having folks be exposed to some of these other types of training, particularly the accounting and admin.
Was there any discussion at the committee about having, the non-core content being not optional for system administrators, or different levels of requirements between trustees and system administrators?
As I recall it, the logic that we had is, as you're a new trustee coming in, you're going to have this initial 7 hours that covers these areas. But then every 2 years, and we said it as 2 years because based on changes that would occur each legislative session, there would be no point for the same person to sit through investments or ethics a second time, but would then start going into these other, whatever you want to call them, modules.
And that's the way I read it, actually. When I read through this, I assumed that people would sort of do their core, and then on an ongoing basis, they would start picking up things in the non-core.
Pick up the other stuff, so that it's not the, I'm going to go to, I've got to go to pension training. Gee golly, I've heard this all before, but it gives them something new to expand on. I was pretty sure it was the logic and what we were trying to do.
And members, and to the point raised earlier about developing or providing this, the board and the agency we can work on developing content to address pension accounting, to make sure that there is a module out there that trustees and administrators can take. I think that might be one of the steps that we look at as we implement this training program. Obviously, the first area will be the core content to make sure the agency is providing online or in person or a combination thereof that training. But certainly beyond that, looking at the non-core, those are also areas where the Pension Review Board can develop its own training program or in coordination with other folks who are providing training, encourage that. And certainly in the rulemaking process, it's fluid. A couple of years down, certain discussions now may need to be amended as we move into items on the agenda later, such as accreditation, the definition of administrators. Those are things that I think in discussions with some of the members on the working group, this is a starting point for the Pension Review Board, and certainly we want to be able to adapt. Topic areas may adapt as well. But again, I think part of the idea is that we will be developing training content in line with the training requirements, and certainly something I think we want to take the lead on in some of these non-core areas as well.
And I think there's a certain logic to that. Let's put something in place. This is new to us. Let's put what we have in place, to make sure we meet the deadlines that have been imposed by the legislature, and then we can evaluate it periodically to see. I mean, you read through this, and logically, when I read through it, I thought, well, okay, later on when you're doing the non-core, you'll start going through these other topics, but it's not required. You can do your 4 hours of continuing in either core or non-core. But if we see some issues associated with that, we could always tinker with the rules on a going forward basis.
One of our challenges, I think, is that we're administering, 93 plans, from very large to very small, and I would estimate that more than half of them will be in the smaller, very small category. And so many of the smaller plans have no plan administrator, so any curriculum, it makes me tilt in the direction of saying the trustees and the administrators need the same curriculum, because frequently for smaller plans, the administrator is one of the trustees. And so I think we want to keep that in mind in our educational process.
And I would generally recommend that we err on the side of a little more flexibility when we first set it up, and then get more restrictive if we see a need. Because I think that'd be easier for the plans to adjust, as opposed to putting in something that's more restricted and then we go back the other way if we find that it doesn't really work.
I believe that the committee, that was really the goal as a whole, flexibility, not to be so encumbersome on especially the small plans, but keep it fluid through rulemaking to where we could accomplish that, but get these rules set, get them in place, but leave it as flexible as we can to make those adjustments.
Mr. Chairman, I'm fine with all that, and I should have said, I think that the quantity and especially the quality of the work that was done by this committee and the staff is really impressive. It was clear an awful lot of thought had gone into this training program, and I appreciate that.
And I echo and agree with that. I mean, clearly this committee is doing great work and still has a few things to do, but we commend on what you guys have done so far. Any other discussion? Well then, I would entertain a motion to approve what the committee has recommended, with the one change that we would add to core content, the category of risk management. So I guess then delete risk control from non-core.
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Cable, second by Mr. Massengale. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. I think that takes us to item 4C. And we receive reports on certain following items: applicability of training requirements to administrators and trustees, PRB educational training program accreditation model, and compliance tracking the PRB training delivery. Michelle?
Yes, thank you. Behind tab 4A, we have a report on an issue that the working group has been discussing and staff has been researching, which relates to exactly whom the training requirements will apply to in cases where that's not immediately clear. The good news, I think, is that despite the volume of information presented in the report, staff were able to boil this down into 3 recommendations for the board's consideration on how to handle these plans, which staff could then turn into draft rules for the next board meeting if that's the board's desire. So if I could start with trustees on page 2 of the document behind tab 4A. As you know, for most retirement systems, statewide, municipal, and TELFRA, statute clearly indicates who are the trustees and who therefore would be subject to the trustee training requirements. However, for about 30 plans organized under Chapter 810 of the Government Code, statute is silent on their governing bodies. These are usually pensions offered by water, utility, hospital, or transportation districts, and some have multiple layers of governance, so it's not obvious who should be subject to the training requirements in terms of trustees. Staff did in-depth research and talked with these plans and came up with the 5 different governing body structures that you see there in front of you, along with associated recommendations for whether they should be subject to training requirements or not. And in each case, staff were able to identify a governing body. I think the easiest way for the board to deal with the diversity of these structures is through the program's rules, and we've suggested clarifying 2 structures that should not be subject. The first are boards or committees which are purely advisory in nature, and the second are boards whose duties are restricted to the creation, termination, or amendment of the plan. But in either of those cases, another board or committee of that sponsoring entity does more closely fit the statutory definition of having fiduciary responsibility for the system's assets and overseeing the investment and administration of the system. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Anybody have any questions? Please
Okay.
continue.
Thank you. Moving on to administrators on page 4 of this document. There's a similar scenario where for most plans, including statewide and municipal, statute either specifically mentions that the board will appoint an executive director of the system, or the system does so, but in either case, that person would be considered the administrator for purposes of training requirements. However, for firefighter or TELFRA plans and the 810 plans, again, things are not so straightforward. In the case of TELFRA, there's a variety of administrator models. The board and city, in certain cases, designate that person, as well as Mr. May mentioned earlier, there are a number of trustees acting as the administrator. And obviously, those trustees would already be subject to the training requirements by virtue of their role as trustee. A couple TELFRA plans and 810 plans have outsourced their administration completely to a third party, which is usually a bank. And staff recommends clarifying through rule that third-party administrators, as you see, this is a rare case, however, would not be subject to training requirements. And that's partially because those persons are already subject to regulations as part of their positions in the financial industry. An item for your consideration, though, on page 6 is the scenario that Mr. May also referenced earlier, which are TELFRA plans where staff is still unclear as to whether the person designated as the administrator truly meets the statutory definition of supervising the day-to-day affairs. And that's because those folks are either in a part-time role or more functioning in more of a clerical capacity. Staff is doing more research to get to the bottom of those plans and the administrator's duties and role, but we could benefit from the board's guidance if you'd like to provide any on whether you would want to speak to that issue in the program's rules, or as another possibility, establish a process where plans in whose administrator fits that description could apply for an exemption and indicate why they believe that their administrator shouldn't be subject to the training requirements.
Again, I thought this was good materials, and it seemed self-evident at first that who would be the governing body of a plan and who would be the administrator of a plan, but then when you look at the sponsoring entities and these committees and advisory committees, I think guidance is helpful and would be helpful for the plan, so I thought this was good work as well. On the system administrator, I think the key would be clerical as opposed to part-time. I mean, either somebody's part-time, but they're really directing the sort of day-to-day operations of a plan. It seems like they'd still fall within the definition. And these are just my personal thoughts, but if it's just clerical, it seems like it's something that they really shouldn't maybe be subject to this training. But I'd open up the board for further discussion.
And members, just to clarify to that point, the statute specifically defines administrator as being designated by the board to manage the day-to-day activities. It doesn't necessarily specify number of hours worked. And I think to that point, and we do have people classified as plan administrators in our contact with the plans, but they're more in a role of a clerical function. In discussion with this, I think through the working group and staff was, does it make sense to essentially create an exemption where the plan would have to petition to say our quote-unquote administrator is more clerical, thus meets the exemption definition or need to be exempted, as opposed to the board trying to pre-exempt or address this through rulemaking. Thus, if a board wanted to require their administrator or whoever's meeting that role to take training, that should be maybe at the discretion of the board of the fund. But to at least provide a process for that. And I think that's about where the working group had gotten on this topic.
And I think one of the keys to that is if your plan administrator is clerical, then somebody else must be directing the day-to-day operations of the plan. And we would just need affirmation. I assume it's the board chair or some designated member of the board who then is subject to the rules and getting training. Anybody have any thoughts on whether we want to try to build this into rulemaking, or we just want to go ahead and put in a process by which people can request this type of exemption?
I don't remember how far we got. I don't know why this is coming to mind, but I was under the impression we talked about leaving it up to the plan to give us that designation, and then through rules decide how we're going to go. But they're going to be tasked with getting that information to us.
And I think that's where it was left. I think we had very little time at the end of the proposal discussion, and I think that's where it ended up. And I guess staff had looked at this and said, does it make sense as we draft rules with that in mind to say we have an administrator who we have a contact with, unless the plan specifically applies to say we don't think this person meets the definition, we would expect that they have an administrator. They would designate that person through the process so we can track those hours when we get to compliance. Otherwise, they can apply and say we think our administrator, quote unquote, is clerical, and although our trustees are taking it, the chair or somebody on the board would certify that this person does not meet the definition.
Do we have any idea of the number of instances that this issue entails?
At this point, we're looking at maybe 5 to 10 that we've specifically identified. There's a few plans that we're still trying to research a bit more. It is on the smaller side. And typically in those cases, as mentioned before, the chair of the board basically serves as the administrator.
What about having a rule that tosses the burden back onto the plan, but just have the plan certify that this person is in a part-time clerical capacity, and there would be no benefit, or however we'd want to phrase it, no value gained by making this individual go through the training. Just have them certified.
And that was one of the options.
And even bypass, the staff review of the situation.
Certainly, we could create a certification form where the chair or a designee of the board would submit something, and we would have that so we would know that they've gone through that process.
Maybe I'm naive, but I would think that if I was in a position of responsibility, whether as a trustee or as an administrator, I would want to take this training. I wouldn't be looking for a way out of it. If the person has an enormous or extensive background in pension management, perhaps, but I don't know. I mean, if you've accepted this responsibility, I would think that you'd want to take advantage of any opportunities to increase your knowledge and awareness of the issues. Maybe, as I said, maybe I'm naive in that. I don't see people trying to dodge this. I mean, yeah, it's a hassle, but
It gets
I would expect it
complicated.
to be interesting.
It gets complicated for the really small plans. If it's a Texas Local Firefighter Retirement Act plan, a Telfer plan. They have 20, and it's firefighters, and they have 20 firefighters. One of their struggles may be just, are they going to, can they even take off to go to meetings? They have fights with the chief over that, or meetings about pension issues. So it's pretty tough on the real small units. But they need to be informed, they need to be educated. I'm not disagreeing with the basic thrust of what we're saying. I am saying it's difficult for them.
And again, I think part of this is that since it's defined very specifically in statute, the issue has come up, but there are instances where there could be some lack of clarity for certain plans. And again, this is the minority of plans, it's a small group.
Yeah.
And if the thought process is, and the discussion at the working group was, create a process where a board, could petition or certify. They don't have somebody who meets that definition, but really to leave it at that.
I think that makes sense. We ought to track the statute, and maybe the rule when you guys draft it have something to indicate that if the plan, or something to the effect that if the plan doesn't have, and then you track the definition of the administrator in the plan, then they should provide a certification, and provide a form that somebody, chair of the board, signs, certifying or make an affidavit that we take their word on it, and then somebody on the board is going to take over that duty, or actually is.
And I understand. I mean, to some extent, I understand issues associated with an extremely small plan. But regardless of how small of a plan you are, I mean, how small can you be? 1 or 2 person plan? As a beneficiary of that plan, I would want whoever is in charge of that plan to at least have had this training to protect, and some of these I understand are pretty small pensions, but $50 is $50. I want somebody to have oversight over it who has some knowledge of the issues.
And I think some of the concerns with the small plans will be addressed, one of these subtopics where, online training and allowing access to programs without, a lot of travel involved should control costs.
Good.
Yeah, I share Mr. Roberts' view of that. You'd like to think that there would be somebody at every plan, at least one person, who would be interested in securing
And it may
this
just
knowledge.
be one person.
And I think it'll also be interesting to learn how many systems or plans are out there that suggest they don't have anybody who qualifies for the required training. Does every system and plan have a board?
The board, and we haven't had an issue with the boards, it's the administrator side. That's where, and again, as mentioned before, a lot of times the chair of a Telfer plan will serve in the administrator role, but they may list their administrator as someone who just files reports with the Pension Review Board. So we wanted to make sure in those instances the boards will all be covered, and we've identified all the boards, and I think staff are comfortable that the rulemaking and the training requirements, we know exactly who that will apply to. It's in these rare instances where you have, and we've identified a couple plans that literally you have somebody who puts in maybe 5 hours a week helping with paperwork, but they've been designated as our contact for filing reports with the PRB. And so are they truly managing the day-to-day activities? That really is, on these smaller plans, has been falling just to the boards. So again, that's created a little bit of an area of gray with the definition. Do they have a system administrator per definition? And then that's where staff has been researching and reaching out to the boards. And again, it's only a handful of plans. And in most cases, the trustees are, in a lot of cases, the chair of the pension fund is doing that day-to-day work. So there will be training. Everybody on the trustee level will be trained under these requirements. So we'll need to get the training. And certainly the tougher area has been these small plans who don't seem to have a board and an administrator. And so we just wanted to make sure in those cases that the board understands that there are some instances of this, and that staff's recommendation would be to create a process where they could certify we don't have an administrator. Obviously, those boards will still be monitoring that they're taking the training.
And maybe that certification say, well, we don't have a designated administrator, but blank, insert title of the board member in charge with these duties, because somebody should have the duties if it's the chair of the board or whoever else.
That's good.
That way we're covered where somebody should be doing this, and we understand you might not have a dedicated person to be doing it, but that just means one of your board members ends up doing it. Is that sufficient clarity for rulemaking purposes going forward?
If the board is amenable, certainly.
All right. We can, and again, you're going to develop rules that will be brought back to us, so we'll have, of course, a final say, and I'm sure the committee will have a chance to look through it all as well. I guess the next item would be for PRB Educational Training Program Accreditation Model.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Behind tab 4B is another issue the working group has been tackling, which is accreditation. And as you know, statute requires the PRB to accredit training provided by entities other than the PRB, as long as that training meets standards that the PRB will set. The next step here would also be for the board to direct staff to draft proposed rules for the next board meeting if you feel comfortable, and rules could include any or all of the components the staff has included in the accreditation model. To get to where we are now, staff researched two other entities, the State Bar and the Board of Public Accountancy, as directed by the working group, and then combined elements from each into a possible model for the board's consideration. There's a visual representation of that on the second page behind tab 4B, and I'd like to briefly walk you through that. So starting with the two blue boxes at the top, both the State Bar and Board of Public Accountancy have standing committees of their boards that set standards that education providers, or sponsors they're sometimes called, must meet. And this is where you might define criteria that the board would choose to set to handle issues that have been raised in the working group, such as, just purely for example, that training must be educational in nature and can't be purely sales-oriented or for networking purposes only, things along those lines. Moving on into the body of the chart, both state, not agencies, but entities, also have two tracks. So on the left, the larger blue box is a sponsor accreditation process, and that would be for regular education providers, so that would be like TechSpurs or the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans, the groups that are out there doing a lot of training. And the idea would be that once staff had reviewed and accredited those providers, they would not need approval of each course that they're offering, but as a safeguard, the PRB could at any time review that educational sponsor to ensure that they continue to meet standards. And both agencies, State Bar, for example, use the majority of their continuing education takes place through that track, meaning it's done by accredited sponsors that aren't needing review of each specific course. Then on the right, you would have a process for dealing with those more one-off type of courses, for approving individual courses. And this is where you would deal with education provided, for example, by new sponsors, folks who are new providing pension education, who are not already accredited, or a course, for example, that a trustee goes and takes in another state that PRB has simply not reviewed or accredited yet. The idea there would be to encourage pre-approval by staff, but you could consider allowing approval after the fact in certain cases. I think I'll stop there and see if there's any other questions. I know there's a lot of pieces of the model.
Anybody from the committee want to comment on this process?
I don't have anything to add.
Okay. So it sounds like it's a model where we would approve certain sponsor accreditation companies or entities, and I guess that they would occasionally make some type of recertification that the programs qualify with these requirements that we have, and so then in essence anything they provide and sponsor would be blessed, and then otherwise if it's not from one of these various entities, then it would be on a program-by-program basis that would be submitted to us to make sure it qualifies with statutory requirements.
Exactly, and it would all be done through rule, and the State Bar and Board of Public Accountancy have very good model rules that we can use to draft to bring to the next meeting.
And I'm familiar with the State Bar rules, and so, that works for us. But Anybody have any further questions or comments?
Well, I might just comment that the staff might find really fertile ground among organizations such as the IFEBP and other entities who may be willing to enter into some financial relationship in which, if the state is encouraging its trustees to go to an organization like that, they could provide a cost break on that training. And there are some sophisticated training programs that are already in place out there, and to the extent that the PRB does not have to reinvent the wheel, I think everybody would be better ahead.
Okay. And then if you'll go ahead, I guess the next item, any further discussion on this? And then this is just for informational purposes in connection with the rulemaking. And then the last item under this 4C would be for compliance tracking and PRB training delivery.
Thank you. Yes, behind tab 4C, you'll see a brief report regarding another piece of the training program. Statute requires the PRB to provide some of the training itself online, as we've already discussed, and to track trustees and administrators' compliance with the training requirements. Staff has begun initial research into these areas and presented some options for the board's consideration. What we're working towards here, in terms of PRB's own online training, we probably won't need to draft rules, but we will need to relating to compliance tracking, though we have more time there. As you know, statute doesn't allow us to track compliance until January of 2015. So we're somewhat ahead of the game here. I'd like to reverse the order of the two issues on the report and talk about PRB's training delivery first, because we have some items for your consideration regarding compliance. In terms of training delivery, staff has begun researching technologies that are out there for putting training online and essentially found two main options. The first would be to use software to create a do-it-yourself course, if you will, and you can do that out of an existing PowerPoint presentation or videos and other media, and then that could be posted on the PRB's own website. Another option would be to use more of a full-service, web-based education provider, and that would be hosted through their site. Trustees and administrators would log in, take a course, and that would be automatically tracked through that site. And then a third idea is there for a possible supplemental option, and that would be that the PRB, of course, over time could also conduct a live presentation and archive it and place it online afterward, or conduct a webinar, and that might be a useful thing to do, for example, for transmitting the most up-to-date like legislative changes or GASB changes or things that come up from time to time that plans should know about. So that finishes training delivery. Unless there's any questions or discussion there, I'd move on to compliance.
How are you actually going to track it? I mean, the state bar, everybody has a bar number, and you actually put that in, and they track hours associated with that. I mean, how are you going to track the hours?
Our initial discussion with our kind of database programmer has been focused on identifying board members individually as opposed to through the plan, so that if a board member were to serve on one board and then move to another, we would be able to sync them up. So much like in other professional continuing education, each individual is identified and they would be able to track their own information. That's where we're at right now. Obviously, we're still developing that in terms of compliance, but that would be the thought. And then as far as the online training delivery, what we've looked at models that similar to what the Attorney General and all the members have taken the open government training online, the videos that all new members have to take, all appointed public officials, developing a model similar to that where we could develop our core content to meet that and additional training. The disadvantage to some degree of that is that it's a little bit harder to track that you've actually completed it, and we can try to build in, and we're looking at what our budget will permit in terms of quizzes along the way to make sure somebody's actually paying attention to what's going on in that, versus what we consider more of a learning management system where it's a little bit more rigorous, it's a little bit more in depth. Of course, there's also a greater budget associated with that type of content delivery. We're evaluating that, but we wanted to present to the board options that staff have been researching, because not only in House Bill 13 but also through the sunset recommendation, we've really been asked to try to put more online. And so obviously we do have a limited budget. There's only so much we can do. So within that budget, we're trying to see what makes the most sense, what's the most efficient way to deliver this type of training. And also going forward, the idea that maybe some of these non-core become core. We develop for pension accounting, obviously GASB, there's a lot going on there. Those types of things that come up in the future, we want to have a sense of what we can do to provide training. Again, we probably can look at in-person conferences down the road once we get this established, but I think there's definitely, in this age, a demand for online training, and so we're trying to figure out what's the best way to deliver that.
The question, I think, was how do you track it? Is it going to be copy a similar system like the bar?
Yes, and that's where we're at right now.
Will be a number?
And then our database administrator worked on the state bar's system, helped develop that. So we are working with somebody who did do that for the state bar. That the way it would, at least at this point, and part of the discussion we're going to get into is do we make it more manual where they would submit to us some certification, or do we create an online system where the plans themselves can go in, whoever the administrator or the board members will have a login, they can go into an online database like the bar, enter what they've taken. Have you taken a pre-accredited course? Did you take a course that was individually accredited? It would show up under that individual person's training hours, and then they would be tracked. We could generate reports. Staff obviously could keep an eye on that, generate reports to the legislature going forward, but that it would be by individual. And then in the instance, let's say somebody leaves one board but goes to another, we would be able to assign them to the new board, and their prior training would carry over. That would be the expectation, so it'd be by person.
Sounds to me like we need a larger budget.
Well, we based on our current budget and our meetings, we believe we can deliver that type of system if the board is amenable going in that direction. That was the thought. The other option is a little bit cheaper but more staff intensive, is to create a simpler database that we keep in-house that's not online, and then require systems and administrators to submit forms to us, somewhat similar to what we do with financial and actuarial reports. There's more paper involved, or more staff time of data entering this. That's one option. It is a little bit cheaper, not much cheaper. The other option that we've looked at is having a database that the administrators, the trustees can log into for their plan at the time. They can update their training. Again, one of the thought processes behind that is board terms aren't always symmetrical. People don't always start January 1st and end December 31st, and some plans they do. Other boards, people get appointed in the middle of the year. So if you wanted to have somebody get their core content within a year, the administrator, the boards know when they get on and off. And so it's easier, we think, for them to manage that way as well. But that was one of the discussion areas that this report was focusing on. Is the board comfortable with us going in that direction? We've gauged both options from a budgetary point of view. We can deliver on either one of those at this point. So those are both options that are very viable.
I'm leaning towards less paper, less staff, and more digital retention.
Yeah, I think the database is the way to go.
Well, but how much does this, we've danced around it, how much is this going to cost? Have you all gotten that far?
We've had initial discussion. The way similar to the state bar, we would not have something that extensive. That's not within our budget, and we don't have that range of training and as many people, obviously. We're looking at something, it basically builds to about $5,000 per page of the database. Right now, we're looking at about 4 to 5 pages. And that was part of our request during the budgetary process, was for funding for this. So we do have funding available to accomplish that. It's certainly, if we were to go in the direction for online training delivery, where we go more of a software that basically allows us to take PowerPoints we develop and translates that to online training, probably similar to what the Attorney General's office uses, less sophisticated, but still allows us to deliver the content. We are well within our budget for this.
Well, would that take, okay, you click through, because I've used the AGs, and I've used some of these that were designed for institutions of higher ed. You click through, it gives you a series of PowerPoints, anywhere from 8 to 50 pages. And then you have to take a little quiz that's 10 to 15 questions, and depending upon the program, you either have to get 95% or 100%. The ones I'm accustomed to, they flat out don't give you your certificate till you finally click on everything correctly. Is that what we're talking about?
Something similar to that, yes.
That's got to be expensive. And then at the end, it spits out a little certificate.
We've identified it's relative, compared to developing a database, it's rather inexpensive, probably in the $700 to $1,000 range for the software that allows you to translate that. Now, obviously, staff or board members who would be helping develop this content, we would need to bring in to help voice over.
We prepare our content and the questions for our exam.
Yes, that was the original thought, that we would develop an in-house.
That would be nice. I just, of course, have no idea what something like that costs.
It's maybe some years ago it might have been more expensive, but it's a highly competitive market right now for that type of training. There's thousands of providers of this type of training, so it probably has driven costs down.
But that's for content we would prepare possibly and put on our website. For third parties, they would have their own seminars and whatever, and then I'd assume there'd be a course number that's already been approved on our list, and once somebody certifies whatever certification they require that they've completed that course, it would almost be the data would click over, okay, they got 2 hours off of this course, and it just goes into some data or spreadsheet in our thing. I mean, is that the way you're envisioning it?
So what we'd envision is so you'd go into an individual plan, Plan A, Trustee A, and then you'd have the core content, 7 hours, and we would develop it so that they would identify that they've gotten training in these, and if we have an accredited sponsor list, did they take it with an accredited sponsor, did they take it, and we would be able to update the individual course that they would have taken. So we can manage that information. So much like the State Bar, where you would have to identify where you got your training, not just that you got your training. We would develop it with that in mind. And obviously if you have a pre-accredited sponsor list, they would be built in. As people apply and maybe get added to years down the road, we would update our database to reflect that. And so you would track it by topic area, number of hours, and who the sponsor or who provided the training.
And you've indicated, from what you've seen so far, we have funds in our budget to pay for this.
Yes, and again, that was part of our request with this legislation, was for additional funding to make sure we had the funding to do this, and it is within our budget. We've been working diligently with programmers. Staff have done a lot of research, and Michelle has read through a lot of options. The online training is a whole industry now, and so there are a lot of options available for us, and we think efficient and cost-effective options to do all of this.
And thus government explodes.
I'm very pleased that you say all that. And but these things tend to grow.
Man.
Yeah.
Well, they're certainly in consideration of our next budget request. I mean, there are more exotic options if we wanted to. I think, though, given where the legislature
let's
has
do
been...
exotic.
No, let's work within our budgetary constraints. Of course we have to. Okay.
Wow.
All right. Michelle, what's the last report you got for us?
Thank you. Yes, so that brings us to, and Chris, thank you for covering compliance tracking. The last page for our issues for consideration relating to how we're going to track compliance. And there are several items there. The first is how to handle trustees who are already serving. As you know, there will be many of these, and the question arises, and the working group discussed, should trustees who are already serving be required to complete the 7-hour core? If so, should they have more time, more than a year to do that, or should they kick automatically into a continuing education scenario? I can walk through each issue or stop. Okay, thank you. The second is somewhat similar. The idea is trustees who are serving multiple terms, who are reappointed, which, as you know, is also very common. Should they be required to take the core again, or should they go to a continuing education only at that point? Same thing with trustees who are serving on multiple boards, which is sometimes the case. If we were to say that they didn't have to do the core, we could certainly configure our compliance tracking system to allow for that and track them accordingly. The third bullet there is related to terms, and Chris touched on this a minute ago in speaking about how terms are not all, they don't start and end at the same time, and they're also not all the same number of years. And essentially with the proposal that's been approved, once you've taken a first year, then you go to a 2-year continuing education. That works well for odd-numbered board terms, but not as well for even, of course, because once you've taken your first year, then you've got an odd number of years left. So the question arises, if someone, for example, has a 4-year term, they've done their first year of continuing new trustee 7 hours, they then do 2 years of continuing education, they're 4 hours, they've now got a remaining year, and do we, or does the board, exempt that last year from training requirements or require 2 hours of the 4? We can, essentially you can do whatever you want, we just will need to draft the rules accordingly. And finally, the issue that we talked about in terms of tracking compliance, whatever database we end up with, whether it's the administrator logging the training in themselves or a manual version where PRB staff does it, we do face the question of how much documentation do we want to receive versus require the systems or sponsors that provide the education to keep. So essentially, we could ask administrators to send in some sort of certification from, TechSpurs that the trustee attended that training that's signed by them that would go into our files, or another model, State Board of Public Accountancy, for example. What they do is have the sponsor, TechSpurs, keep those records, and they require that they keep them through rule for 5 years, so that if PRB felt the need to go and audit that, X systems trustee actually did that training, we could do that, but we wouldn't be having to receive all the and catalog all the documents ourselves.
Okay. Did the committee go over any of these issues?
I don't think we got that in depth as to exact. We talked about it, but we didn't get that in depth on how to handle it.
Well, we can discuss it at the board, although I think a lot of this level of detail would be more appropriate for the committee to make recommendations and bring back to the board. Because some of this is the mechanics of how it can be worked out.
I think we said a lot of, we're going to have to talk about this, this, and this.
I assume that a fairly long meeting at the end, you didn't quite get to everything that you wanted to. I don't know if anybody wants to give any thoughts right now that the committee to consider.
Is one of the questions whether existing trustees are grandfathered or whether they have to go through the training?
Openly, I would hope that we have a way to clip out and let them show what so they would not be required to take those core hours if they've already had a certain amount of training.
At least during the initial transition period.
Yeah.
See, my inclination would be everybody should take the training.
Yeah.
What's wrong with taking training? Maybe you...
Unless you can document.
That you've taken the training.
Certainly. If they have a significant amount of training they can document, I would much rather see us accept that.
Now, a lot of this is based on what TechSpurs has done in the past, and a lot of people, like myself, have certificates.
I would think that if you've been sitting as a trustee on some of these things for several years, you've probably already taken the training. So now
again, but that goes back to you're saying, should we make them take it all over again? I'd hate to do that if we have some significant education amongst these members that have gone through so much already.
But then it's a question of how do we show that?
Put it before the accreditation committee we're going to form and see what they think about it.
Perhaps the committee would like to consider an exam to place out.
I'm sure that would be a popular choice.
We will come up with a recommendation.
Yeah. And I think based on where this ended with the working group was there was some discussion about a phase-in, and I think obviously the rules would be in place September 1st. That might provide an opportunity to work with folks who may be existing members in those systems to explain whether it's submit something between September and the end of maybe December of 2015 that would identify that you've received something that meets the core, that it covers the core, some type of documentation to show that there has been core training. We could look at that as an option. We can discuss, obviously, at the working group, this is one of the matters we'll need to. Or the other option is just to start, as of January 1, 2015, any existing member at that point would need to get 7 hours of core training that year. Those are kind of, I think, where we left off with the working group, and certainly something we can tackle at the next meeting. But we're trying to get some feedback from some of the other members who aren't on the group, and sense from the board if there's a preference, or you've got options going forward with that.
Well, I think we should recognize that there's a considerable amount of continuing education that has education and continuing education that has already gone on. I mean, it isn't as if we've got 93 boards out there that have never dealt with any educational issue. Be easy then. Yeah, sure, they need to comply on day one like a new board member should be required. But that's not the environment out there. There's a considerable amount of education that's already occurred. With some of these board members have 8, 10, 15, 20 years experience and know quite a bit. It seems to me a continuing education requirement is appropriate for them, and not treat them like a board member that's comes on as a new board member in the future.
Well, I mean, I think that's also a valid point. But if the idea is to have some uniformity to assure that all trustees, nobody's kind of slipped through the cracks and not gotten the core training, then it seems like you'd at least want some type of certification or a process to verify that somebody who's been on the board for 5 years actually has already had this core training 7 hours.
I agree. That's good. I mean, I do agree with that.
Because, I mean, the idea is to have uniformity in the core, that at least everybody's had a chance, have this basis on which they're working with their plans. Again, I think I have faith in the committee that you guys would come up with a great solution to this.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, for reappointed trustees, I would think, again, what I would think about is it depends on the window of reappointment. I mean, if they've just been reappointed, then you would figure they're covered. If it's, I mean, I don't know. I would look for the committee recommendation. If it's been 10 or 15 years since they've sat on a board of trustees, maybe it's not a bad idea that they go through the core again, assuming they did it to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. If they've been gone quite a while, they should come back and go through the core. But if they're just a reappointment of somebody that's been on 8 or 10 years, then I think it would be meeting.
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, if the idea is that somebody's continuously been on the board and they're just being reappointed, then I don't think that's a new trustee.
Okay.
But if they dropped off, I thought the question was, well, what if they dropped off for a year or two? Do they have to take it all over again or not? And I would think at a certain point the answer is yes, but it's just whether or not there's some window. Well, I was only off for 6 months. Do I really need to take it all over again?
Right.
I'll let the even-numbered board terms work through the committee, considering you all the ones who recommended the biennial.
I want to change that recommendation.
Yeah, it seems like you could address that.
Now that I see the question face, a question like that.
Mr. Chairman, I have a question, please.
Yes, sir.
Has the staff or the working group considered the training that a trustee would get in the normal course of serving as a trustee? That is, having an actuary explain the experience study or an investment consultant discuss the findings in the investment environment, issues like that. Because that certainly can be valuable education and training.
And part of the thought was, we've looked at that as under in-house training, and we would have a model where systems that do that type of training would be able to apply for credit for that time. So certainly we're developing this process to allow for that.
Thank you.
And we spoke to the possibility of them asking before they take it, and even looking after they've taken some course and allowing that to be accepted.
But somebody correct me if they have a different understanding, but I think, Keith, that both through TexPERS and through TELFRA, there's been ongoing training that would include training from actuaries and training from investment consultants. So that's why I was reacting earlier that, gee, these guys, a lot of them have been through a lot of training already. And so I think both those areas have been dealt with. But it's a broad sector out there. There's people that never have been to any training. but there are some with considerable experience.
Yeah, I appreciate what Texpers and other organizations do, but also there are some trustees who may not have the time to go to a Texpers or somewhere else, but they're dedicated trustees, and if they're going to the board meetings and they're hearing an annual investment consultant or actuarial experience study or other information like that, then they're getting a pretty good education in that capacity.
Are you asking how that would factor in with respect to the...
Yeah, I'm suggesting that staff recognize that as a training possibility.
And that's what we were calling, I guess, in-house training. And then a lot of the larger statewide systems do most of their training in-house via that model. And so we have already met with them to work to make sure that we incorporate an opportunity to count that. Because employees retirement system teacher, a lot of them do that type of training for their members. During the board meetings, they'll carve out an hour for training from the actuary, from investment consultants, and so we will build in a process to allow for that accreditation, and that's also spoken to in statute.
But I assume there's a certain amount of formality to that, either it's before the board meeting or for this segment of the board meeting, it's really for the sort of like continuing education.
Yes, and we've already opened lines of communication with those systems, and we will have a process where they can say, this system is going to bring in somebody to speak on the importance of an actuarial experience study. We're going to walk through how assumptions are set, why this is important, and then they would be able to either pre-apply to say, PRB, here's what we're going to walk through. We can review, obviously, make sure it meets some basic standard, and make sure that counts, because certainly we want to count that type of training as well. So we are building that into the process.
Okay. And that sounds good, because, those types of things clearly are training.
Yeah, that kind of speaks to that there's no one specific way people get training. There's a variety of ways, and so as we've tried to develop an umbrella that covers everything, we've had to consider that. And ERS is actually one of the members of the working group, and I'm sure as we move forward, systems that are specifically doing in-house training we'll be working with directly to make sure we're on the same page, where the board is going, what the rules will look like, so that there's no surprises or issues as we kind of move into implementing the rules for this. But there are a variety of ways outside of groups that do provide trustee training, Texpers and CPERS. A lot of groups do, a lot of other funds do theirs in-house, and so we are building that into our process.
Okay. Well, I would ask at the next working committee meeting to go ahead and specifically list these items that you had for board consideration and come up with recommendations in light of the conversation we had today.
Absolutely.
Anything further?
I would only comment that I think that, again, that the quality and quantity of the work that's been done in this short period of time is really impressive, and I would commend the staff and the working group and the members of the committee who've worked on it.
Well, I move we put Keith on the subject.
That's for later in the agenda.
Nobody seconded it. All right.
Wait, I'll second it. He was chair.
The road to hell is paved with good intentions.
All right, thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
All right. Our next item for consideration is item 5, receive the report of the Actuarial Committee on its January 29th, 2014 meeting and consider related matters. And I'll turn that over to you, Bob.
Okay, and I in turn will turn that over to Chris and then make comments as Chris goes through.
Members, behind tab 5A is a summary report of the January 29th Actuarial Committee meeting where the committee discussed and met on the financial health study that was a part of House Bill 13 from the 83rd legislative session. To refresh members and for our new member, the financial health study, the PRB Board was directed to conduct a study of the financial health of public retirement systems in the state, including each system's ability to meet its long-term obligations, taking into account contributions made to, benefits paid by, and investments made by the public retirement system. Additionally, we've been asked to comment on recommendations for how a system may mitigate its risk of not meeting its long-term obligations. So the committee met, and there's a few bullets of items that were discussed. I'll just quickly hit some of the main points the committee looked at. Going back through the last, say, 15 to 20 years to look at the kind of the evolution of the financial health of our state's public retirement systems, to focus on contributing factors to the health of those systems, to consider whether systems were actually getting their actuarially required or actuarially recommended contributions, to include information related to best practices in funding and plan governance, and information to help some of the smaller systems as well. There was some discussion about obviously national issues that are going on via California, Detroit, Illinois. We did receive some invitation from the audience, or comments from the audience, and one particular item that we've heard before is the idea of actuarial soundness being, I guess, a term that not everybody's in favor of. I would say that in terms of what we've been directed to do in this study, that it's very clear that the board's been asked to conduct a study of each system's ability to meet its long-term funding obligations. So I think we might be able to avoid using the word soundness specifically in our study to meet the requirements of the legislation. But that's kind of essentially the summary of the committee meeting, and be happy to answer any questions.
Okay.
Moving on, behind tab B is a presentation that was made at the committee meeting talking about the study itself. Just to give the members who weren't there some background, what staff did and presented to the members of the committee was a breakdown of the current amortization periods as reported in system actuarial valuations and their prior valuations, basically showing that we've seen an increase in the number of plans who have longer or infinite amortization periods, not meeting the Pension Review Board guidelines. And again, the guidelines spell out 40 years as a minimum threshold for an amortization period, with the recommended range being 15 to 25 years. And so we've broken out those amortization periods greater than 40, between 25 and 40, and then less than 25 per the guidelines. Additionally, we've provided some information, just general aggregate information on total net assets of the public retirement systems in the state of Texas, as well as the kind of the annual year-to-year change in assets, and then aggregate returns on the next 2 pages, and basically mirroring what we've seen in the stock market. There has been a bounce back. Obviously, 2008 and 2009 were significantly negative, and we have seen a rebound in the asset values across the state. We haven't really seen a lot of the information for 2013 just yet. Some of that has trickled in, but obviously last year being a significant gain in the stock market, we will start seeing those reports come in over the summer. And then lastly, on page 4 of this we put together for the committee a summary chart to show the number of systems with amortization periods over 40 years, how that's grown since 2000. And that was essentially what we presented to the committee is, this is the condition we're in right now. If we're looking at the financial health of public retirement systems, what we've seen over the last 15 years is a significant increase in the number of systems with amortization periods over 40 years, a significant increase in the number of unfunded liabilities, and we kind of laid that out as a starting point for discussion for the study. And so I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have, or if I can go into the outline itself if the members don't have any questions.
Just one comment at this point, Chris. This is a first draft. This is not a final report, and our deadline for having a final report is August 31. That's still a draft. Our completed draft, final draft, would be by August 31 this year, and then the retirement systems are given through the fall to offer comment, and then our final report is due December 31, and it will include comments from various systems. So this is preliminary. We've done a lot of work. Staff's done a lot of work, but it is preliminary.
When I looked at this data, it was a little bit surprising to me that 2012 was trending negatively. Everybody knew 8 and 9, and then 10, 11 looked more positively, but then 12 started to trend negatively again, and so I'd be don't think it'll make it into our report, but I'd be interested to see what 2013 starts showing with various indices. And then clearly the increase in plans that are infinite is of concern, and I'm sure this report will address those type of issues.
For the amortization periods, obviously not every system does an annual report, and again, because most systems use a 5-year smoothing method, a lot of folks in 2012 were still absorbing the losses of 8 and 9 and hadn't been able to fully include the gains that they've gotten since then. Due to the timing of the report and valuations not necessarily being done every year for every plan, different systems may not have been able to show some of the gains in the last couple of years. We have been trying to communicate with the systems, and as we move forward over the summer, try to get as timely information as we can to include. And as mentioned earlier, the preliminary report is due August 31st, so we'll present that final preliminary report at the August meeting, a period of time for systems to comment, and then the board is entitled to revise the final draft and required to include any system comments received. Probably during that fall, we'll need to set a time period for when comments need to be received by, and then present the final report to the legislature by December 31st.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
Does the draft outline of the study of the financial health of public retirement systems, would that include capturing information about the actuarial cost and funding methods that are used by the systems?
That would be what we've included under, I guess, and again, this is a very rough draft. We expect that this will be a fluid process, but under, I guess, on the outline 6A3, we did want to capture the assumptions and methods used, and typically, when we've issued reports to the legislature, our guide to public retirement systems, we include a breakout of the cost methods, the assumptions, the rate of return assumption, inflation assumption, and how we've presented it in the past is what % of plans use entry age normal, what % of plans use projected unit credit, what % of plans use unit credit, and we go through all the assumptions that and present it that way. Our thought was we'd have some similar presentation on who's using what assumptions, what % of plans are using the different assumption methods. Certainly, part of the discussion today was to make sure that we've captured, at least initially, the most salient and important areas of that the members think need to be included in this study.
We certainly need to include that in the report. That, for me, seems somewhat... I'm relatively encouraged. It's mostly entry age normal is the cost method, and to some extent it's projected unit credit. Only one of the 93, a very small plan, uses an aggregate method, and the judicial plan one is a pay-as-you-go method, but otherwise it's pretty heavily entry age.
Will we be capturing whether or not they're using an open or closed period?
Yes, and we do open, close, as well as level %, level dollar. We do break that out. That's included in, and certainly we can provide you the last Guide to Public Retirement Systems, where we walk through all that by plan. And the thought, probably, at least at the staff level initially, and we obviously want to get board feedback, was this will be submitted to the legislature prior to next session. We've always issued our Guide to Public Retirement Systems at the beginning of the session, that we probably want to sync up those two, the study with that report as well, whether they be Part A and Part B or tie them together. Our Guide to Public Retirement Systems includes all the current financial, actuarial, benefit, membership, assumption information of all the plans in the state. The legislature has found that very useful. We think it's a great report. The plans have liked that. So some version of that I think would be helpful, because you have the study, but you also want to have all the data that goes along with the plans. And so how that ends up looking, if it's just one final report without, or maybe a Part A and B, certainly we want to consider that as we move forward, because we think this would be a useful report going into next session.
Mr. Chairman, one other thought, if I might, and that is, in most cases, cities around the country that have gotten into real pension trouble, and people typically will think of Detroit, which is referenced in here, and Stockton, San Bernardino. The real underlying problem in those cases is not the pension plan, it is the fiscal condition of the city. And I don't know if it's beyond the scope of this office to do, but frankly, I think that some measure, some relative measure of the cost of the pension plan or the burden of the pension plan to the city's capacity to pay it. You can have a very high or infinite amortization period, but if you're fiscally sound and have no problem increasing your contributions, then you may be just fine. You can have a very short amortization period, but if making the required contribution, even for that short amortization period, is a fiscal burden, then you can be in real trouble. And so the amortization period by itself doesn't really tell a whole lot, as Bob knows. And if it's easy, and I don't want to get into mission creep here, but if it's easy to get some sense of the fiscal capacity of the city, annual revenue, annual general fund expenditures, whatever, I think that probably would be revealing.
I think that's a good point. My sense of what's happening in Texas is that because of our robust economy, we don't have the Detroit or even the city bankruptcy. I'm not aware of a single city that's in real dire straits in the state of Texas. So we're probably somewhat atypical of a national standard. But I agree with that we should do what you're saying.
Well, and it might be a little difficult to do that in some fashion. We'll have to take a look at what's included there are CAFRAs. There are things that cities put out there, but it's hard to say whether we can discern what page from the CAFRA we would include for this type of information. I mean, I guess, the history of whether they made their ARC or any kind of contractually obligated payments, if they haven't made that, I mean, clearly that's one indication, but we'll just have to take a look at it.
And certainly a lot of that information is available online in this time and era, and we can't access most of that. The question would be, to what level do we identify, and obviously want feedback from the board and the committee as we move forward, identify for certain systems what % of the city budget or tax revenues the contributions would take up, what % of that, or is it more of a general discussion about the need to always be mindful of the sponsor's financial health without necessarily having to provide all that level of detail. There's been some discussion about, at least at a minimum, looking at the contribution shortfall for systems that are not getting sufficient contributions, to at least provide some idea of what the contribution shortfall, either as a % of pay or as a dollar amount or both, would be necessary to get that system to a sufficient amortization period where they would be able to meet their long-term obligations. The next step could be from there also to start, at least for the systems that may not be able to be in that position right now, what is the relative health of the sponsor. We can certainly begin to look at that, and certainly be happy to work with the members of the committee and the board to see to what level of detail we can include that. But that's an excellent point.
I appreciate your consideration, and I think maybe the best example is the TRS of Texas. The fiscal effort that was being made by the state to the TRS was really relatively small, and the state of Texas, the TRS of Texas, had an infinite amortization period until recently. And so on paper, just reading those metrics, TRS looked like they were in bad shape. In fact, it's really a very well-funded plan, and the fiscal effort required to get them into to looking completely different on paper was relatively small, and the legislature took action to make that happen just this past year.
Good point.
Yes.
Members, if there aren't any other questions or comments, moving into the outline, and really, again, this is very fluid. I think as staff are moving through, and we'll work with the committee and bring back to the board at the May meeting something a lot more fleshed out. We'll move on to the actual evaluations report if there are no other questions.
Okay, go ahead.
Members, this is the February 2014 actuarial evaluations report, and what this report represents is the information as reported in the actuarial evaluation of the system, and this obviously is the basis for a lot of the charts that were in the prior report. This shows the current amortization period as reported in the systems valuation, as well as the prior amortization. And as noted earlier, the teacher retirement system no longer has an infinite amortization period. It's probably the most significant change in terms of large systems that have moved from the green area of systems that aren't meeting our guidelines. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the board may have.
Well, I wanted to comment at this point. I think as I've talked with Dan Moore, the staff actuary, and Chris, even since the actuarial committee met, a thing that we've identified that we're going to make more clear is the importance of, and my biggest concern, excuse me, for state plans would be those plans that are not contributing the ARC, or an annual required contribution determined by an actuary. And we do have instances that we're going to correct in this report that will shift certain of our plans from showing a 30-year amortization period to showing an infinite amortization period, because the 30 years that we're showing is the amortization period they would have if they were making the contributions required to produce a 30-year amortization. But if their actual contributions are less than that, noticeably less than that, then their amortization period is not 30 years. It will be it's infinite. And so that change will be made, and then looking carefully at that relationship over time between the contribution they were actuarially required to make and what they are making. We have quite a few plans that are making the actual required contributions. We have some that are not. And we think that the ones that are not are the ones that need the most care and attention in terms of needing to make change to strengthen their financial condition of their plan.
And that'll change will be made on the next report that's delivered?
Yes.
That's a good point. Actually, that's crossed my mind over the years as well. Any further discussion or comment?
Members, if there's nothing else, I'll move to the next item. And at the request of the Actuarial Committee at the January 29th meeting, we've identified some additional pension studies, and there are numerous studies out there right now on the financial health and issues related to public pensions. We identified 3 studies that we wanted to provide the board, and you have a short summary of some of the salient points of those studies. We thought, in part, to give the members an idea of some of the topics that are out there, some of the items that this study may cover. Obviously, this will be Texas-specific, looking at Texas retirement systems and issues here. But again, because pension financing is fairly standard for public plans, you will see overlap between other reports that have been issued. We intend to keep providing the members more updates. I know there were a couple studies that came out since we provided this information. The American Academy and the Society of Actuaries have both issued reports or briefings. But quickly, we wanted to just give some background on other reports, including the Moody's Investor Services report that came out early in February, which discussed some areas that will overlap with the Pension Review Board study, including looking at factors that increase the unfunded liabilities of systems, the payment of the ARC, as well as some discussion of legal issues that are out there. And some of the stuff in the Moody's report is not in Texas, but there are similar cases in Texas that we'll want to keep an eye on. For the National Institute of Retirement Security, their report looked at lessons from well-funded plans and really gave their best practice recommendations. And as our study will include best practice recommendations, we wanted to provide the board an example of recommendations that are out there. And then lastly, the Center for Retirement Research at Boston College had done a study comparing state and local plans, and made some comments relative to what they determined was what captures the financial health of a public retirement system, and they focused on the funded ratio and the percent of the ARC paid. And so again, there'll be some overlap with what the Pension Review Board develops, and we wanted to give the members an idea of some of the information that's out there in other studies. I'd be happy to answer any questions the members may have.
I found this really helpful to have this one place, so that was helpful. Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Bob. Our next agenda item is receive report on public retirement system reporting and compliance, including the Form PRB 1000 Investment Returns and Assumptions Report. And Nick Ballard with the TPFA PRB will deliver that report.
Good morning, members. My name is Nick Ballard. I am the investment analyst at the Pension Review Board. Members, if you'll please turn to tab 6 in your packet for our list of non-compliant plans as of January 2014, or we've included our list. As a recap to the November meeting, all of the non-compliant plans from November, with the exception of Waxahachie Firemen's Relief and Retirement Fund, have submitted their reports to our office. Our office has contacted Waxahachie Fire, and they have stated that we should receive their 2012 financial reports along with their 2013 reports by the next reporting due date, which would be April of this year.
Did they say any explanation why the 2012?
My understanding is they had an issue with their auditor, and so they're in the process of working that out. They just lumped in their 2012 and 2013 audit reports.
Just to note, the city had been helping them with those reports due to budgetary constraints. I believe that the fund has had to find a new auditor, and so they fell behind in that sense. But we've been in communication with them, and we expect them to become compliant this spring prior to the next meeting. And I would like to note and thank the staff for the great work. This probably is the best compliance report this agency's ever had. And it probably helps to some degree the sunset recommendations, which changed the annual reporting requirements. But certainly, I think this is the shortest non-compliance list we've ever had, at least as far as I can remember.
I agree with that. Our list of one. Additionally, if you'll turn to the next page in the packet, we've included a letter that we sent to inform previously non-compliant plans that they are now compliant with our reporting requirements.
And members, this ties into the change in House Bill 13, where we are now required to post the non-compliant list. We always posted it online, but a posting online as well as a letter to the sponsoring entity within 60 days, I think that helps spur action on behalf of the plans. And when those plans did submit their reports, they inquired if we would be sending a letter back saying that to the sponsoring entity, this plan is now compliant, and we thought that was appropriate. So we did want to include a copy of what we sent to those sponsoring entities.
That makes sense.
All right. And if there's no questions on the compliance, going to the next page in this section, we've included the finalized investment returns and assumptions report, the PRB 1000. This form was approved in the November 2013 board meeting and was posted on the PRB website in December. Our office has received this report along with annual financial reports and membership reports for plans whose reporting due date was January 27th of this year. And so far, questions pertaining to the report have been minimal.
Okay. Any further comments or questions? All right. We'll move on to the next agenda item, which is item 7, receive update on the PRB list of companies engaged in scrutinized businesses, operations in Iran. Nick?
Yes. So in tab 7 of your packet, we have an update on the PRB list of companies engaged in scrutinized business operations with the government of Iran. To recap information discussed at the PRB November meeting, Senate Bill 200 added Chapter 807 to the Texas Government Code. This chapter requires the Pension Review Board to prepare and provide a list of scrutinized companies doing business in Iran, and to provide the list to the Texas statewide retirement systems, including the Teachers Retirement System, the Employees Retirement System, the Texas County and District Retirement System, the Texas Municipal Retirement System, and the Texas Emergency Services Retirement System. Additionally, a copy of this list must also be filed with the presiding officer of each house of the Texas Legislature and the Texas Attorney General. During the November meeting, the procedure for maintaining this list was approved, and the procedure is included in your packet. Staff have since compiled the list of scrutinized companies and provided it to the statewide retirement systems. Including your packet is a copy of the letter that was sent to the Employees Retirement System, as an example, along with the list of scrutinized companies. We have also included the procedure for maintaining the list, as well as a sample certification letter that systems may use to notify the PRB if they have received notification from a company included on the scrutinized companies list that indicates that that company should no longer that company is no longer actively engaged in scrutinized business operations in Iran. We've also included in your packet the letter that was sent to the Attorney General's office providing notification of the current PRB scrutinized companies list. And additionally, as an operational issue, the procedure for maintaining the list of scrutinized companies includes a statement that the PRB will rely on publicly available information for compiling the list, including the quarterly report published by the Florida State Board of Administration. And the next update to the Florida list is scheduled to be released in March. And at that time, staff will review the updated Florida list to determine whether an update to the PRB list is necessary.
Okay, good.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Roughly how much time did it take for you to accumulate this list?
It was not difficult to accumulate the list. It was kind of the research that went into kind of looking at what publicly available information is out there, and also developing our procedure, our internal procedure for compiling and maintaining the list.
We spent quite amount of time over the summer leading up into the fall to get an idea. We did not receive any additional funding because there are institutional investor services that provide this. We did not receive additional funding. It wasn't within our budget, so staff did have to do a lot of research on our own. We did work with the systems affected, and through a process identified Florida as the a publicly available list whose statute mirrors Texas statute. We walked through that. That did take a considerable amount of staff effort. Hopefully, going forward, with most of the work is behind us, so to speak, in that regard. I think, though, developing the certification letter, working with the systems did take a good amount of staff time to get this done.
Thank you.
And Keith, if you want some more information, we did go over this at prior board meetings where you weren't a member of the board, and the staff I identified, I think there were 3 or 4 different states that had comparable statutes and how they got the information. And there was this whole process that we identified who we would follow and what we would do in terms of that information is available. And I'm sure Chris can kind of give you a thumbnail if you want to hear it all.
Well, we did find, though, that the state level information was better than the federal level information. In most cases, I think we found that the federal information, and a lot of people depended on Florida. They had not only the most comprehensive research going into their list, the most providers, they also provided information on why people were going on and off the list, whereas some states we would just get a list with no information of why a company went on or off. And so it made sense, and also the statute really synced up with what we have in Texas. And then through working with the systems and members of the board, the certification letter was developed. We did vet all of this through the Attorney General's office as well to make sure that we covered our basis for developing this. And just to refresh, we are required to publish this list on an annual basis. We can update it not more than quarterly. So we will look at what the Florida State Board of Administration releases this spring and evaluate if we need to bring an update to the board at the next meeting.
No indication whether the companies on this list are feeling the pain.
No, we haven't heard anything back from them at this point.
Thank you.
Anything further on this? Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.
The next item on our agenda is item 8, receive report on agency website, including the posting of the model ethics and conflicts of interest policy for Texas public retirement systems. Chris?
Members, behind tab 8, you'll find our quarterly web report. You can see the website statistics, as well as the top 10 downloads year to date and top 10 pages. Be happy to answer any questions that members may have on that. If not, I'll move on to the next portion of this report. To refresh the members and for our new board member, House Bill 13 directed the Pension Review Board to post model ethical and conflict of interest standards on our website by December 31st. We worked through that process in the fall. So you have 2 things. You have the revamped best practices resource center page, where we've outlined not just and provided the standards provided by the board as an example. We've also added to that webpage a list of relevant state statutes, sample retirement system policies, and we'd like to thank, again, those systems that have worked with us. Teacher Retirement System, Texas County and District, and Houston Municipal have been very gracious to provide us copies of their ethics policies, as well as other best practice resources. And again, the thought was that not only did we want to meet the statute and provide a sample of what an ethics policy and conflict of interest disclosure requirements could include, but we wanted to provide more than that, to provide resources for systems that might be looking at developing or updating or amending their existing policies. So we've revamped the web page as such. So we do have an entire page dedicated to these items. As well, we've included the finalized version, the model ethical standards and conflict of interest policies that are on our website. And again, we'd like to thank the systems that helped us walk through this and some of the attorneys that we've worked with. I think staff did a great job on this. We did get final approval from the Attorney General's office that we've covered everything, that we're in compliance with the directive from House Bill 13. At this point, we feel that we'll keep monitoring this as things need to be updated, but I think we've done a great job with this. Again, I'd like to thank the staff that have worked really hard on this.
Okay, Jim. Any questions? Okay, let's move on to item 9, receive report on the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act. Go ahead, Chris.
Members, behind tab 9 is an updated report. We've provided the board in the past reports because this is, I believe, the third session of Congress, a version of this legislation, otherwise known as PEP, that has been filed. The report does reference the other filings in the prior sessions of Congress. Did want to note, and I think part of the reason behind this bill, as you noted in bold, there's language that the bill would explicitly exempt the United States government from liability for current shortfalls or state or local pension plans. I think that's probably one of the genesis of this bill, is that there is concern in the instance of maybe, as referenced earlier, Stockton, California, or Detroit, Michigan, would the federal government be liable for a bailout for an insolvent pension fund or insolvent city? And so from what our research has indicated, that is one of the overriding concerns of why this bill has been filed. To refresh the members, it creates a federal level reporting requirements for state and municipal pension systems, somewhat similar to Pension Review Board or state reporting requirements here, but then goes well beyond that, requiring additional information and reports, and also a penalty for non-compliance involving the loss of tax-exempt status for issuing municipal or state bonds. Our understanding at this point is that this bill is likely to meet the fate of the prior filings, i.e. nothing's going to be done with it, but we do want to keep an eye on this issue because it does have an impact if it were to move for public retirement systems in the state of Texas.
So I agree that just keep an eye on it and keep us apprised if it looks like it may become law, but I don't think we have to spend a lot of resources on it if it looks like it's going to go the way of the other and just kind of die in committee or not get anywhere.
I was the one who asked Chris to bring this up, and partly to see if, Keith, you have any sense of where this bill stands in this session of Congress. Is there a high chance that it will pass, a very low chance that it will pass? In the past, we have made it, we felt that as a minimum we should make the federal agencies aware of our Pension Review Board because we're doing a lot of the things that, or some of the things they would do. And could you tell us what your take on the current status of that bill, Keith?
Mr. Chairman, Bob, the bill as it sits now is about as it has sat for the last few years, and it seems to be going nowhere. My organization's concern over the years has been that the language of the bill will get stuck into some omnibus bill in Congress and pass without hearing or discussion. That seems unlikely, but that's been our biggest concern. I think it's encouraging that this year the number of co-sponsors the bill has, especially on the House side, is far fewer than it had before. This year only 10, where last year or a couple of years ago, there were more than 40 House sponsors. And also this year, there are no sponsors on the House bill from the state of Texas, which is a change.
Good. Okay, Chris. The next item would be receive, update, and discuss the 83rd legislative interim charges.
Our members, behind tab 10 is the list. The House and Senate have begun issuing their interim charges. We are at that time of the interim as we move into the spring and summer. So we do have the charges from the House Committee on Pensions. We did want to provide this to keep the members updated. The majority of these charges relate to the state healthcare systems for ERS and for TRS. Item 4 on the House Pensions Committee is examination of GASB. Obviously, this is to refresh the members, obviously, GASB has issued new standards. 67 and 68 will replace GASB 25 and 27. The transition for 67s during this fiscal year for the pension systems, and 68 will begin starting July 1st of 2014, those fiscal years for 68. Obviously, this is a pressing issue and something that the committee will look at. We have issued in the past a report on this, and will continue to monitor what we hear from the pension systems on what they expect their GASB numbers to look like. And again, item 5 is the standard overview of agencies under the jurisdiction of the committee. So I guess that provides the committee some flexibility to ask us to appear to talk about what we're doing, which I would expect at some point we would do. But other than that, that's the extent of the charges related to pensions for the House side right now. On the Senate side, the next page, there was nothing specific to pensions at this point that's been issued. We did identify for the Intergovernmental Relations Committee looking at debt at the local level. Given the comptroller's reports that we were involved in leading up to last session of local debt and them considering unfunded liabilities of pensions as a local debt issue, we did want to keep an eye on this in the event that we are asked to provide any information to the committee for the hearings. We haven't received anything specific from them at this point, so at this point we're just monitoring what's going on, and certainly if anything changes we'll let the members know. But these are the kind of relevant interim charges as it stands right now.
Very good. Anybody have any questions on that? All right, Chris, go ahead and with the strategic planning under item 11.
All right, members, again, it's that time of the interim. As we move into the spring, we begin the strategic planning process for fiscal years 2015 to 2019. We provided the board a rough outline of what this process will entail. This can vary a little bit from biennium to biennium, but sometime probably in March, we'll start getting instructions from the Legislative Budget Board on the strategic planning process. We'll begin our base reconciliation, and probably one of the important steps between now and the May meeting will be an evaluation of our performance measures. There have been, due to changes from our sunset bill, there have been some changes to reporting requirements, and we expect when we sit down with the Legislative Budget Board, as well as the Governor's Office to evaluate this, that we'll be looking at potential changes to measures and or the measure expectations. But we did want to give the members a heads up as we move through this process, and we provided the current performance measures. If the members have any comments or concerns that they would like to express, to let us know, to let me know as we move into that, because likely we'll begin this process between this meeting and the May meeting. At the May meeting, we should be able to start having a draft of the strategic plan for the members to consider. What we've included in your packet now is just the rough outline of the section areas that are included. And so we just, again, wanted to get the members aware that we're about to start that process again. Ultimately, what this leads to is the issuance of our strategic plan and our legislative appropriations request that we will submit sometime in July or August. Again, this is the standard process as we lead into next session. We'll start evaluating our current budget and any requests that the board would like to include for exceptional items. We can start looking at more in detail at the May meeting. Obviously, we'll have more to bring you, but we did want to give you a heads up that we're about to start this process again. I'd be happy to answer any questions the members may have.
Any questions? All right, good. Our next item is to review and discuss the report from the Executive Director on the following matters: fiscal year 2014 budget, following the 2013 personal financial statements, TexPERS annual conference, and the introduction of new PRB staff. Chris?
Members, behind tab 12A is our current operating budget as projected through the end of this week, which would make halfway through the fiscal year. And everything as presented is the original adopted operating budget we're in line with. Certainly we'll evaluate as we move to May any need to shift our budget around going forward. But again, and this accounts for prior discussions with training delivery and database development. I'll be happy to answer any questions the members may have. If not, I'll move on to the next tab. Behind tab B, members, you should be receiving or may have already received the Texas Ethics Commission's letter to notify you. It should be coming. They just mailed them out this week. So if you haven't received it by the end of the week, please let me know. And hopefully, I think our staff have emailed the online link to the Ethics Commission to you. Because we no longer have legislative board members, we were exempted in the past with our legislative members. All members and myself need to file the personal financial statements with the Ethics Commission. We provided the template so you can get a sense as to what you'll need to file. I believe the deadline for filing is April 30th. And again, they sent those letters out this week, so you should be receiving that. And hopefully, if you haven't by the end of the week, please let us know. We'll follow up with them. This information is required to be filed on an annual basis, so what members and myself would have to file for 2014 will be for 2013, calendar year 2013 financial statements. So we did want to let the members know that you should expect to see this. If you have any questions, certainly let me know. The Ethics Commission does have some resources available. Sometimes, in my experience, having had to file for, I guess by mid-October, I had to file for 2012 as the Executive Director. Sometimes it's not as clear. So now that I've been through that process, if you have any questions and you don't feel that you're getting appropriate answers from the Ethics Commission, please don't hesitate to contact me either. But this will be something that we all need to file by April 30th. Are there any questions from the members? All right. An update for the members on the TexPERS annual conference. I was asked, and we'll be presenting an update of the Pension Review Board's activities, essentially kind of all the information we've been talking about to summarize for the attendees of the conference. I will be presenting Tuesday morning, Tuesday the 25th. I think I'm currently scheduled for a brief update of the activities of the Pension Review Board. And expect that a lot of the information we've covered here will update the attendees of TexPERS on. And then the last item, we do have a new staff member, Brian Burnham, who's our newest analyst to join the agency. We're excited to have him. He's come all the way down from Michigan, so this weather today doesn't bother him at all. He probably thinks it's summer. But we're excited to have him on the staff. And he brings a lot of background in economics and statistical analysis, and we're happy to have him on the staff.
Welcome.
Great, welcome. Okay, item 13, discuss and consider board approval to attend 2014 annual TexPERS conference. I think this was in light of if there are any board members who'd be interested in attending the conference. Does anyone have an interest in attending?
I have an interest, but I don't want to prohibit anybody else from going if somebody else does.
It's
I've
March
got a schedule
23rd
conflict.
through
I
26th.
can't.
Okay, so Rob's out. Okay, well then, Mr. Mascale's the only one who appears has a stronger interest than others.
I'd like to go, but that's not...
Yeah, members, it's March 23rd through the 26th. It's, I think, the last week of March.
Well, then I would entertain...
Where is it? Is it in Las Vegas?
It'll be in Fort Worth.
Hence the word TexPERS, Las Vegas, Texas.
It can be cheaper to have a meeting in Las Vegas than in Lubbock, Texas. I got somebody fired for saying once.
It's in Fort Worth. Well, then I would entertain a motion to approve the attendance of Mr. Massengale at the 2014 annual TexPERS conference.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Motion made by Mr. Prenard, second by Mr. Cable. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right. Our next item is to discuss and consider approval of the Executive Director Performance Goals. At our last meeting, we asked Chris, I think it was our last meeting, we asked Chris to prepare some performance goals that he's presented and is included behind tab 13. And it's not a long document. I'm sure we've all had a chance to read it. For the benefit of the audience who maybe hasn't had a chance to go through it, I'll just read the key elements of it. And it says, Executive Director Performance Goals completely and within stipulated timeframes provide information and reports as required by law or as requested by the relevant legislative committees, the Office of the Governor, and the Legislative Budget Office. That's one. Implement within stipulated timeframes new agency projects and programs from the 83rd Legislative Session, including the financial health study, development of continuing education for public retirement system trustees and administrators, Iran scrutinized companies list, and model ethics and conflicts of interest policies. That's two, and some of those goals have already been obtained. Three would be provide sound fiscal and overall management of the agency. Four, keep board advised on pension issues at federal, state, local, and private levels. Five would be provide leadership and development opportunities. And six, develop and work to operationalize a vision for the agency to become a national leader in the area of public pensions. I thought this was a good document and really summarized what we have been discussing. Does anyone have any other comments or questions on this? If not, then I would entertain a motion to approve the Executive Director's performance goals as presented to the board.
So moved.
Excuse me.
Motion made by Mr. Roberts and seconded by Mr. May. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, the next item is an update on committee assignments. We actually have a vacancy on our research committee. And Mr. Massengale has offered, or at least acquiesced to my request, to go ahead and fill that vacancy. So I'm going to move Mr. Massengale to be part of the research committee. That actually frees him up from his duties under the actuarial committee. And we're going to assign our newest board member to the actuarial committee. So he'll go ahead and be in the actuarial committee, and Mr. Massengale move to the research committee. And with those changes, I think all our committee vacancies have been filled. Our next item is call for future agenda items. Again, if anybody has anything they want to put on the agenda for next time, or if members of the public, please get that information to Chris, and he'll be able to put it in the appropriate place. Next item is item 17, date and location of next board meeting. So our plans for the next two meetings of the PRB, so people can plan accordingly, would be to have a meeting on Wednesday, May 14th, and then the one after that would be Thursday, August 28th. Now, those are maybe somewhat tentative, but they're maybe penciled or very hard pushed down pencil. And we think that's probably likely those would be the dates, and we're planning accordingly. Hopefully most of the board, if not all the board, can attend. I know there have been some conflicts in the past, but I think at least we have a quorum.
Mr. Chairman, could I back up to future agenda items?
Sure.
I just thought on Sunday, first time ever, I believe, a pension practice council meeting of the American Academy of Actuaries is going to be held in Austin. They invited Keith and I to attend, make short presentation. I understand, Keith, you had a conflict and are not going to be there.
That's correct.
But I'll be there, so I would like to just make a very brief report at the next meeting about my brief statement to them about what the Pension Review Board is about and any other developments and questions that come out of that discussion.
Good.
With this group.
Sounds like it's been worthwhile.
After all those actuaries finish with Austin, the city may never be the same.
Yeah, it's a lot hotter deal.
You know it's changing when the actuaries show up here.
Okay, good. Anything further? All right, then, again, the members of the public are always welcome to speak on a specific agenda item, but we have set aside a time under agenda item 18. If anyone in the audience would like to make any comments or public comment, please come forward. Not everybody rush to the podium at once.
Seeing no further comments, I move to item 19, adjournment. I entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Motion carries. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Yeah.